Hi everyone, I'm Whitney Morgan, Hashimoto's coach, creator of the Thyroid Reboot Method, and co-founder of the Functional Health Alliance. Today I want to talk to you about the Mercury Tri-test from Quicksilver Scientific. This is one of the functional labs that I often use with clients. What's very unique about the Mercury Tri-test is it utilizes what's called mercury speciation analysis to separate methylmercury from inorganic mercury, measuring each form of mercury directly. Now, just like previous videos that I've done about some of the lab tests that I use, I'm not going to take a super deep dive into the Mercury Tri-test. Rather, I just want to give you a sense of what is so unique about this test and what sets it apart from other options out there. The Mercury Tri-test looks at two forms of mercury: methylmercury, which primarily comes from fish consumption, but sometimes in certain situations, a small amount of methylmercury can also come from amalgam-derived mercury that's swallowed with saliva. Then there's the inorganic mercury, mostly derived from inhalation of mercury released by your dental amalgams. And inorganic mercury can just be in the air. And there are environmental exposures, particularly any kind of skin whitening cosmetics. And then also there's a possibility of some demethylation of methylmercury showing up as inorganic mercury. You might be asking yourself, okay, Whitney, why does this matter? Why do I care that there are these two forms of mercury? The reason why it's important is because methylmercury is eliminated from the body into the hair, and inorganic mercury is eliminated through the urine. So that begs the question, how do we test for mercury? There are three different industry standards. The first is blood, and by blood I mean unspeciated, just your basic serum blood check. This contains both methyl and inorganic mercury. However, serum is dominated mostly by methylmercury. So when you get a regular blood test that's looking for mercury, it's mostly going to reflect your fish consumption. And then there's hair, which only contains methylmercury. And when you see low levels of mercury showing up in the hair, that typically correlates with low fish consumption. And finally, there's urine. The mercury that shows up in the urine is inorganic mercury. But I want you to keep in mind that low mercury levels in the urine can indicate either there's a low body burden or you're not excreting that inorganic mercury very well. So obviously, using any one of these three methods as a standalone form of testing has its limitations. And what's so cool about the Mercury Tri-test is it looks at all three mediums. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to walk you through a sample report. And once you understand the basics of the Mercury Tri-test, it's pretty clear why it can be such a valuable tool when we're investigating underlying triggers of chronic illness like Hashimoto's. What we're looking at here are three graphs that represent the body burden of mercury in the blood. Only the top two graphs are meaningful. The bottom graph is really just for CDC reporting purposes, so we're not going to talk about it. So let's look at the top graph first. This represents the amount of methylmercury that's in the blood. And if these were your results, you would be that blue band going across there, and you can see that that blue bar is firmly in the orange range. And optimally, where we want methylmercury to be is below 2. So at the very least, in the bottom of that yellow range. So clearly, we have an elevation of methylmercury in the blood. And the likely recommendation here is to reduce fish consumption and choose cleaner seafood options. The second bar is evaluating inorganic mercury. The optimal level for inorganic mercury is actually below 0.05, so in the bottom half of that green zone. So just like with methylmercury, you can see that the body burden here for inorganic mercury is elevated. The most likely causes are amalgam fillings and even amalgam that's underneath crowns or inside root canals. But excess body burden can also occur due to poor detoxification after amalgam removal. All right, so based on the information we see here, we know that there is a current excess body burden of both forms of mercury. So the next question is, how well is the body excreting each form of mercury? And that's where these ratios come into play. The ratio between blood and urine allows us to determine the excretion capacity for inorganic mercury, and the ratio between blood and hair allows us to see how well the body is eliminating methyl mercury. So in each of these graphs, you see a black line that separates the orange space from the white space, and then you see that little black box. The little black box represents excretion. So what we want to see is we want that black box to be either on the black line or above it. When it falls below the black line, that indicates poor excretion. And clearly that's what's happening in the graph on the left, which is the inorganic mercury. So the body burden that we saw in the blood may not be due to any current exposures at all. Now, if we look at the graph on the right, we see that the black box is firmly on that black line, indicating that the detoxification of methyl mercury is adequate, which confirms for us that the body burden that showed up in the blood is likely due to excess fish consumption or poor seafood choices, or both. And before we move to the next slide, I want to mention that it's really common for these graphs to tell two different stories. Okay, there are 4 basic patterns that can show up on a Mercury Tri-test. The first is called load-dependent concentration with good excretion. Basically, that just means even though you're detoxifying okay, your exposure is high. The second pattern is retention-influenced concentration with poor excretion. In other words, exposure sources are probably not the main issue. The problem here is poor detoxification. Pattern number 3, high inorganic mercury and low methyl mercury. This is why a standard blood test to check for mercury levels is not the best choice. And then the fourth pattern, high demethylators. These are the people that have a tendency to demethylate the mercury they're getting from fish and turn it into inorganic mercury. The reason why I point out these patterns is to illustrate why it is so important to make sure you're working with an experienced clinician when you're running a Mercury Tri-test. So you might be wondering, okay, Whitney, that's great for mercury, but what about all the other heavy metals that might be a problem for me? Well, the reason why we look at the Mercury Tri-test is because as goes mercury, so go many of the other toxic metals. So if you're having trouble excreting mercury, most likely you're holding on to perhaps some cadmium, arsenic, lead, or other toxic metals. That brings me to what is, in my opinion, the best practice when running a Mercury Tri-test for the first time, and that's to order Quicksilver's blood metals panel as well. When I'm looking at metals overall, I'm mostly concerned with what we call the big 4, cadmium, lead, mercury, and arsenic. So the blood metals panel provides information for all 4 of those metals. And when paired with the Mercury Tri-test, the blood metals panel can give us a pretty comprehensive view of other toxic metals as well as nutrient mineral balance. In case you're wondering why it's important for you to figure out if you have heavy metal toxicity, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. First, cadmium can accumulate in the thyroid gland, damaging thyroid tissue. Arsenic has been shown to increase TSH and lower free T4 and free T3. Inorganic mercury can trigger thyroid autoimmunity, and lead can impair the pituitary thyroid axis and alter TSH levels. All right, folks, I hope that's been helpful. I hope you learned something. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the comments or reach out to me at LinkedIn, Instagram, or on Facebook. See you next time.